Lincoln, a chronicle of the long, bitter, and heroic struggle to save the American Union. KC, we are. Where? KC. Chapter 1, Origins. 13 sisters beside the sea have a care, my son. 13 sisters beside... This is the colonies. 13 sisters beside the sea have a care, my son. Builded a house called Liberty and locked the doors with the stately key. None should enter it but the free. Have a care, my son. Stephen Vincent Benet, John Brown's body. Sir Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12th, 1809. 1809 is 2023. February 12th, that's over 213 years. 213 years ago. How many scores is that? That's 10 scores. 10 scores, almost 11 scores ago, 10 scores and 14 years ago, at a place called Sinking Spring Farm, about 3 miles south of Hodgins Mill in Hardin County, now LaRue County, Kentucky. I bet you the average Kentuckian has no idea where Abraham Lincoln was born. The time and the place are significant. At the time of Lincoln's birth, Thomas Jefferson was within a few weeks of the end of his time as third president of the United States, yet Thomas Jefferson's presidency was to influence the life of Abraham Lincoln, because it was in these years that there was inaugurated and established a Democratic Party against which Lincoln was to work and fight throughout his political career, and over which he was at last to be victorious. So they're saying Thomas Jefferson established the Democratic Party, and then Lincoln is going to have to fight the Democratic Party with his own Republican Party. The Democratic Party claimed Thomas Jefferson as its founder. It stood for the maintenance of the independence of the individual member states of the American Union and for a restricted interpretation of the Constitution of the United States, more particularly where the powers of the Union government were concerned. So Jefferson is going to buy the Louisiana Purchase. He's the third president. Jefferson's the one that penned the Declaration of Independence. He also penned the Tree of Liberty is to be watered and manured with the blood of patriots and tyrants. So John Adams and George Washington were Federalists. And since he was the third president, then he was rejecting the Federalists. Sometimes they say Democratic Republican. So the Jefferson Democratic Republican Party had opposed the Federalist Party, to which John Adams and George Washington, Thomas Jefferson's two predecessors, had belonged to, and which had stood for the development of a stronger national government for the United States. With Thomas Jefferson's election to the presidency in 1800, there began a period of power for the Democrats, which continued practically uninterrupted except for a term of 4 years. Until in 1860, Abraham Lincoln himself was inaugurated as the 16th President of the United States of America. What? Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated? Well, we got to secede. He said that you could protect the slavery thing is protected. I don't care. He ain't a racist bigot. We got to get out of here. Lincoln was born in the state of Kentucky. For a motherfucker that's a Confederate, it means you ignored 30 presidents. They don't have an opinion about Chester A. Arthur. They don't know about no James Garfield. They don't know about no William McKinley. All the progressive era, even the Republican Teddy Roosevelt, they don't even know. Lincoln was born in the state of Kentucky. The first thing to notice about the state of Kentucky is that it's a southern state of the American Union. Not really, it's central. It's right there in the middle. It's not southern. They try to be southern. They pretend to be southern. But southern in what sense? Being on a farm? I mean, that was like 100 fucking years ago. Lincoln was born a southerner. There's farms in Iowa and Montana and fucking Washington too. So being a southern, it seems like you're a Confederate fuck. Oh, you're a racist piece of shit, huh? Criminal fucking barbaric dumb fucking pile of shit. Oh, okay. That's what being a southern is. But Kentucky's right in the middle, so why can't we just be the, the great uniter? The great uniter of all countries and states. His whole political, that'd be a perfect, right there in the middle. There's 7 states, like, adjacent to Kentucky. That'd be a good spot to have the capital. But no, you're going to pretend we're like Alabama. You ever been to Alabama? Nah, that's too far away. Why are you associating yourself with that fucking racism? Because you're stupid and you don't know how to convince people or have any empathy or understand friendship or love or solidarity? What the hell? Tranquility and solidarity? You get the hell out of here with that. His whole political career is associated in men's minds so exclusively with the North that at this point has forgotten it. Should not be overstressed, of course. After all, Lincoln left Kentucky, as we shall see, at the age of 7. And he never lived afterwards in the southern state. Right, and he was also on the western side of Kentucky, so he actually never went to the south. He stayed in Kentucky and then went to Illinois. Never went to Tennessee, never went to Alabama or Florida. Motherfucker stayed right there in the central part of the country. And then went north. And then went to D.C., went east. Went a little north, went a little east. And only went south to burn Georgia down to the ground. But he did leave in South Carolina. But he did live in states where Southern influences were felt. His first 7 years had made him open to that. He was to show himself alive. Southern attitude, Southern view. That's another thing. How's New Mexico not Southern? How's Southern California not Southern? They're trying to fucking monopolize a cardinal direction. We're the South. You know, if you really want to go south, go to Chile. You want to go south, go to Venezuela. Go to South America. You're real Southern, huh? Okay, then why don't you go on to Brazil? There's a Confederate colony down there. Go on down there, you Confederate fucking piece of shit. There's a colony in Brazil for you. He was to be called a Southerner on some occasions. He was set to speak in mature life with the Kentucky idiom, take it all in all. Take it all in all, says J.G. Randall. From his earliest breath to public burdens of 40 years, Kentucky was a part of Lincoln. The second thing to notice about the state of Kentucky is that it was not one of the original 13 states stretching down the Atlantic seaboard. It was a frontier state. It had been carved out of those great tracts of land which, after the War of Independence, had been ceded by Great Britain in the Treaty of 1783. These lands stretched northwards to the Great Lakes, westward to the Mississippi River. They covered an area in which nowadays 10 states of the Union, in whole or in part, are established: Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, and Alabama. Greenbow, Alabama. But at the time of Lincoln's birth, it was still wild and undeveloped. Only 3 of these states had been organized: Kentucky in 1792, Tennessee in 1796, and Ohio in 1802. Don't ask any Kentuckian when they were founded or who the first 5 governors were. And governors? Oh, we don't know about that damn democracy, damn republic. We don't know nothing about no damn republic. It is of fundamental importance in the life of Abraham Lincoln that he was born on the frontier. His grandfather, Abraham Lincoln, had moved from Virginia to Kentucky, which was still a county of Virginia at the time. About 1782, his father, Thomas Lincoln, had bought a farm on credit in 1808 near Hodgins Mill. Old Hodginsville, no Hodgins Mill. And it was in the log cabin that on that farm that Abraham Lincoln was born. And there he had lived for the first 2 years of his life. But Lincoln was not only born in a frontier state, so we're the first West. Kentucky was the first West. You had 13 original colonies, and then there was like, let's get on past the Appalachian Mountains. Let's get on with it. He lived his whole life until he became president in frontier states. When he was 2, his family moved to a better farm on Knob Creek, 8 miles from Hodgins Mill. Knob Creek, isn't that a whiskey or liquor or some kind of bourbon? Again, purchased on credit, but in Lincoln's 8th year, they were on the move again. And this time they moved out of the state of Kentucky into Indiana to the north. They reached Indiana in the autumn of 1816, and in the same winter, Indiana became a state of the Union here at a spot called Pigeon Creek Farm near what became Gentryville in Spencer County. Lincoln's father built what was known on the frontier as a half-faced camp, a structure closed on 3 sides only and open on the 4th, save for a curtain of skins. In this rude shelter, the family lived throughout that winter, and indeed almost for 12 months before a cabin could be constructed. In the autumn of 1818, an epidemic of illness called the milk sickness came upon the settlement. It was 30 miles to the nearest doctor. Lincoln's mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, of whom we know very little, fell a victim to the milk sickness, and on October 5th, Nancy Hanks Lincoln died. Abraham's older sister, Sarah, who was only 11, was left to manage the household throughout that winter and until in the autumn of the following year. Lincoln's father married again. His second wife, Sally Bush Johnston, was a widow with 3 children. She was sensible, energetic, and kind, and she soon made life a little easier for Thomas Lincoln's family. In particular, she encouraged Abraham to make what use he could of the meager opportunities that existed for schooling. He had a strong affection for her, and he often acknowledged his debt to her. She lived to see him president of the United States and to receive the news of his death with the patient fatalism of a very old woman. Lincoln himself has told us something of what his life was like in those days. It was a wild region, he wrote in 1859, with many bears and other wild animals still in the woods. There I grew up. There were some schools so called, but no qualification was ever required of a teacher beyond reading, writing, and ciphering to the rule of 3. If a straggler supposed to understand Latin happened to sojourn in the neighborhood, he was looked upon as a wizard. There was absolutely nothing to excite ambition for education. Of course, when I came of age, I did not know much. Still, somehow I could read, write, and cipher to the rule of 3. But that was all. I have not been to school since. The little advance I now have upon this store of education I picked up from time to time under the pressure of necessity. That was Abraham Lincoln. In 1859, he wrote that this lack of opportunity for schooling is a symbol of the life which was led on the frontier. Lincoln appears to have had 5 short sessions of schooling, 2 in Kentucky and 3 in Indiana, scattered over a period of 5 years, and in all they add up to less than a 12-month. He had to learn for himself. He read diligently, his stepmother says, and read every book he could lay his hands on. There were not many, but he seems to have been able to obtain the Bible, Robinson Crusoe, Aesop's Fables, whoop whoop, The Pilgrim's Progress, Weems' Life of Washington, and A History of the United States. And when these failed, he turned to the Revised Statutes of Indiana, available at the house of the village constable. But the day's work was not reading. It was wielding the axe, first put into his hands at 8 years old. Hewing the wood and drawing the water, planting the corn, catching fish and game. It was a hard life and not very healthy. There was one exciting and eye-opening adventure, a trip by flatboat down the Mississippi to New Orleans. Here at the age of 19, Abraham Lincoln saw the first great city he'd ever seen. New Orleans, in a community as cosmopolitan, as colorful, as squalid, as seething with life and commerce and conflict as could well be imagined. He came back by steamboat. There could be no doubt that the whole trip made a strong impression upon him. After Kentucky and Indiana came in March 1830, when Lincoln was 21 years of age, the move into the third frontier state in which his life was spent, Illinois. It was this state he lived until his election as president. So he didn't get to Illinois until 21. Illinois calls themselves the land of Lincoln. Indiana is the land of Indians. But basically from 7 to 21, his most formidable years, I guess his young, youthful years can be said about Kentucky, but he barely can remember Kentucky. What does he know about Kentucky? But he goes to Indiana from 7 years of age to 21. So he knows Indiana. He knows Illinois. And his heart might be in Kentucky because he was born there, but he doesn't know much about Kentucky. In this state, he lived until his election as president. Illinois had been admitted as a State of the Union, the 21st state in 1818. Here, says Lincoln, they built a log cabin into which they removed and made sufficient of rails to fence 10 acres of ground, fenced and broke the ground, and raised a crop of sown corn upon it the same year. In the autumn, all hands were greatly afflicted with ague and fever, to which they had not been used, and by which they were greatly discouraged, so much so that they determined on leaving the county. They remained, however, through the succeeding winter, which was the winter of the very celebrated deep snow of Illinois. From this time begins that part of the life of Abraham Lincoln which is the greatest interest here. He was now 21, and in accordance with the custom of the frontier, he left his father's cabin to take up life on his own account. It will be necessary to follow his succeeding years in some detail, but it is always to be remembered that they began and they continued in the lands of the frontier. But the frontier influenced the life of Abraham Lincoln in ways which go far beyond the fact that he was born and lived in frontier states. It was the political problems of developing the frontier lands of the United States that produced the critical issues upon which the political career of Abraham Lincoln was founded, and this makes it necessary to record that the lands in which these problems were to arise were not solely those lands lying westward to the Mississippi ceded by Britain in 1783, and out of which Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois, the states of Lincoln's birth, boyhood, and manhood, were established. There was, first of all, the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, 6 years before the birth of Lincoln, by the courageous act of President Jefferson in his first term of office. The United States purchased from Napoleon I what was called Louisiana, an expansive country as large as the United States itself at that time, and extending from the Gulf of Mexico were no wider than the modern state of Louisiana, right up, roughly speaking, to what is now the northern boundary of the United States. Within its confines have been established in whole or in part 13 states of the American Union. To this was added by 1819, when Lincoln was 10, Florida, and a strip of land which joined the states of Mississippi and Alabama with the Gulf of Mexico. A long, complicated transaction with Spain, part conquest. In 1818, a part of the Louisiana Purchase was ceded to Britain in exchange for a part of Canada, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota. I guess these are the states that came. So you should thank Haiti, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota. Thank Haiti, because if it wasn't for Toussaint and Dessalines conquering Napoleon, Minnesota, Wyoming, Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, Colorado. Thank your lucky stars, Colorado. You wouldn't exist if it wasn't for Toussaint and Dessalines, the black revolutionaries out of Haiti that overthrew the French oppressors. Missouri, Oklahoma. Thank your lucky stars. Arkansas, Louisiana. I'm sure they give thanks. I'm sure they did homage. I'm sure they did homage to Saint Louverture, Toussaint Louvetti, Dessalines, Jean-Jacques Dessalines. So arrested substantially through Lincoln's boyhood and young manhood. And then in the 1840s came a great burst of expansion, which added to the United States all the land that lay between her western boundaries and the Pacific Ocean. There was the Texas annexation of 1845, the final acquisition by treaty with Great Britain of the Oregon Country in 1846, and the Mexican Cession of 1848. These were to provide problems in the years of Lincoln's manhood, but already in his boyhood there had been rung what Jefferson, then in his old age, called a fire bell in the night. A crisis had arisen in the organization of that part of the frontier called the Louisiana Purchase, because of a controversy of which we have said nothing so far, but takes us back once more to consider Kentucky. It was said that the second important thing about Kentucky, the state of Lincoln's birth, was that it was not one of the original 13 states, it was a frontier state. The third important thing about Kentucky is that it was a slave state. But the importance lies not in any supposed influence that life in a slave state might have had on Lincoln's mind. It is doubtful if he ever saw a slave while he lived in Kentucky. But the fact that a state, not one of the original 13, should be a slave state, it leads us at once into the nature of the slave question in the United States. When the American Union was inaugurated in 1789, all the original 13 states except one, Massachusetts, recognized slavery. Damn, so Massachusetts are a bunch of badass motherfuckers. Always have been. But the majority of the leaders at the... I don't give Boston enough credit. But the majority of the leaders at the convention in Philadelphia, which drew up the Constitution, were opposed to slavery. Men like Washington, John Adams, Jefferson, and Madison, to name the first 4 presidents of the United States. But it had been found that South Carolina and Georgia were unwilling to enter the Union unless slavery was permitted within their borders, and thus it came about that the Constitution of the United States recognized the existence of slavery. Although the word itself is not used, and made certain concessions to the slaveholding states, there was, for example, provision relating to the return of slaves who escaped. No person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall in consequence of any law or regulation therein be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. There was further a provision in the Constitution forbidding Congress to pass legislation prohibiting the importation of slaves, the overseas slave trade, before 1808. So, exceptions were Kentucky itself, Virginia, Vermont, Maine, Texas, California, It started out with his birth. February 12th is the birth of Abraham Lincoln. February 12th, 1890, at a place called Sinking Spring Farm, about 3 miles south of Hodgins Mill in Hardin County, now LaRue County, Kentucky. Where were you born at Sinking Spring Farm? He had 3 places. He goes to Knob Creek, so he goes from Sinking Spring Farm, sinking, to Knob Creek, and then he goes from Knob Creek to another place. And then he leaves Kentucky when he's 7 years old. And then he goes to Indiana, and he goes to Indiana till he's 21. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free, he said, June 16th, 1858. It was a solemn and awful prediction. In 1819, however, there occurred an event which, to those who could have remembered in 1858, and Lincoln was one, must have been full of warning. At that very moment when the states were equally divided, a proposal was made which upset the equilibrium. The people of the territory of Upper Louisiana, lying to the north of the state of Louisiana and part, of course, of the Louisiana Purchase, decided to claim admission to the Union as the state of Missouri. And Congress and Man, I don't know if I like this motherfucker's tone. I don't know if I like the tone of your book, you son of a bitch.